Well, we're still in the book of Nehemiah in our series Ask the Exiles, and we've been asking some questions and trying to find the answers in the lives of the people who their whole story is contained in the Babylonian captivity. And of course the Babylonians were eventually overtaken by the Medo-Persians, and there were returns made of people who had been in captivity back to Jerusalem, and this is their story that we're tracing and we're learning things from. So some of the questions we've looked at have been: am I concerned about God's glory? Is my influence positive or negative? Am I a team player? Last week's was, do I need to be reminded of the bigger picture? And today's question is, have I got stickability? Have I got stickability? The last time we examined Nehemiah's progress report, which is found across chapter 3. And we saw how he mentioned landmarks along the city wall and named workers who were doing the rebuilding around those landmarks. And not only did we see that Nehemiah named individuals, but that he also highlighted the specific trade or job that many of them had in everyday life. For example, some were actually goldsmiths and others were merchants, and there's some others too. Now, we ran out of time last Lord's Day and only got as far in our journey around the city as the valley, the area between the valley gate and the armoury. And that took us up to chapter 3 and verse 19. Now remember how I described the map of the city of Jerusalem at that time, roughly to look like a tennis racket. I have no idea what put tennis racket into my mind, but roughly this shape with a tail at the bottom, and that lower long southern thin bit is what was referred to as the city of David. So Nehemiah's last movements that we looked at have taken him up the eastern side of that, if you like, the handle of the tennis racket in an anti-clockwise direction and going in the direction of the water gate. So, verse 20 of chapter 3. After him, Baruch the son of Zabbai earnestly repaired the other piece from the turning of the wall unto the door of the house of Eliashib the high priest. After him repaired Meremoth the son of Urijah the son of Koz another piece from the door of the house of Eliashib even to the end of the house of Eliashib. Now, we'll just stop there, because if you think back to the beginning of this progress report, which we looked at last week, the very first verse of chapter 3 gives us that. You'll see that name, Eliashib the high priest. So there he was, named there in the first place that Nehemiah chose to begin his report at. He's there in the very northernmost part of the city, and he's there working on the wall along with other priests. And here we have, all of these verses later, his address, which is very far from where he was working. And we notice here, by looking at that Eliashib didn't repair the section that was closest to him. We pointed out that others did. We saw the phrase, against their house, against their dwelling. People did work close to where their house was. So the area where he lived certainly needed attention. We've discovered that in today's reading. But he went away from his home and his family to work elsewhere. Now, what's important to notice here is that in Nehemiah telling this story, he doesn't portray this as being negative. Eliashib, therefore, we can take it, hasn't done anything wrong in working away from home. And so we must accept that his reason for being in another place, while his own neighbourhood was in need of repair, was an honourable reason. So it took him away from home. But here's the thing, he didn't lose out. He's working for the Lord, he's rebuilding, he's doing so in another place. Nehemiah, in recording this, is not putting any blame on him for doing that. He's left his own area, but he hasn't lost out, because in his absence, others are looking after the place where he and his family live. Now that made me think of something that happened in my own life and in my own testimony. And you've heard of this incident, I'm sure, I'm in my 5th year here now. Due to change any time. But whenever I got the call to the church in Kilrea over 10 years ago, it was at a time when I was still at home, my father having died, and my mother, her health declined almost immediately afterwards, and her health was pretty poor just at that time. And that was a big part of the decision making. What's going to happen whenever, for the first time in all of her life, never mind just her married life, she would ever be on her own at a time when she was in physical need. She had diverticulitis. If you know anything about that, it's not great. And many's a night she needed assistance through the night and so on. But here's the wonderful thing. Whenever I was being chatted to by the elders in the Kilrea church, of course I told nobody anything. Even my closest friends didn't know that I was being considered. And that was only made public whenever eventually the church did vote and the call was issued. So up until that point, this was all very quiet. And I was saying, Lord, I could live in Ballymoney and drive to Kilrea. It wouldn't be a big thing. But the church had insisted that I should live in the manse in the town. And I saw the benefit of that, of being there amongst the people, very much so. Well, unknown to me, my sister and her husband were thinking of selling their house, and they got their house sold, got a very good price for it, and they bought a house 3 doors round from where my mother and I were living. So I went off to work for the Lord at the call of the Lord, and the Lord brought everything together that somebody would be right there and really be a brilliant help during all of the time until my mother went to be with the Lord when I was here, as many of you know. So you can be serving the Lord somewhere else and worried about family things. And you can make decisions regarding family and think that the Lord won't look after family. The Lord will look after your family. He will. Why would he not? Why would he call you to do something and make those you love suffer? The Lord will look after them. And here we find a man working away in another area, and here was a team who came in and repaired the area that he had left in his absence. Well, verses 22 to 26, I should say, concludes that whole section then in an anti-clockwise way. So that whole section called the City of David. So verse 27 then. After them, the Tekoites repaired another piece over against the great tower that lieth out even unto the wall of Ophel. So we're being taken on a journey then, still anti-clockwise from the 6 o'clock position, if you like, to back up round towards the northernmost part. Then verse 31 moves there. After him repaired Malchiah, the goldsmith's son, unto the place of the Nethinims. You remember they were the people who supported the Levites. And of the merchants over against the gate, Mifkad, which is a word for inspection, the inspection gate. So now they're really at the 2 o'clock position going anti-clockwise. And they were going over to the corner, and between the going up of the corner onto the sheep gate, which is where we started, repaired the goldsmiths and the merchants. So the whole circumference of the walls of the city have now been accounted for in Nehemiah's progress report. So although the area covered by each group of people named was a fairly large area, quite an expanse in some places, yet all the areas are accounted for. There were no gaps. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say that there wouldn't be a stretch where there wouldn't be some person right on that spot. They were all accounted for, and there were no gaps in responsibility. But believe me, there would have been plenty of opportunities for more people to get involved and spread the load. There were no gaps in responsibility, but there have been plenty of opportunities for more folk to get involved and to spread the load and lighten the load on the shoulders of the others. You know, whenever we think of the Lord's work here in this Northern Irish context, I'm sure we probably think that we've got it covered. If you even look at the string of Baptist churches that are in this immediate area, from Glengormley, Rathcoole, Exiles, Green Island, Carrickfergus, Whitehead, they're all quite close together, really. And then there are many other evangelical fellowships in the same location, and they're certainly true to the blood and the book, and there's a good gospel witness around here. We might say, this is well covered. There are no gaps here. Well, there are certainly no gaps in responsibility. But there are plenty of gaps, because if you have your eyes open, you'll notice that there are plenty of gaps. Whenever I had the privilege, and it was a privilege, of going in before restrictions, going into White Abbey to do P7 RE. And for 2 terms, 2 different P7s, I'm in every Thursday. Quite a commitment, but I enjoyed it. And I did RE with those 2 classes. But as I asked the questions, upwards of 30 children, and asked very basic questions, very basic Bible questions, I soon worked out that I could count 5 out of that class who knew something of the Bible. Now, do you get what I mean now by gaps? That's a massive gap. That's widening. That's increasing, and I'm sure in the Holiday Bible Clubs, both here and up at Mossley, we saw the same thing, and I'm sure, Andrew, you see something similar teaching at school. Massive gaps. Generations now have no clue as to what goes on inside the door of a church. There are gaps in the Lord's work, and because of that, there's a lot more pressure then being put on those who are trying to work for the Lord. Do you know who loves gaps? The devil. Absolutely. Because in this absence of an influence in the lives of our children and young people, one of the highest costs of restrictions has been that in the past couple of years, is that the brainwashing of the devil has been there and heightened and increased in the absence of the teaching of the Word of God and letting children know who God is. I think of these words from the Lord in Ezekiel chapter 22 and verse 30. Sad words. Imagine if they were true of this area today as God sees it, because we have this idea, but let's think, if this is what God thinks as he looks down in the Monkstown, Jordanstown, Newton Abbey area, and he says this, I sought for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none. Are you filling the gap of intercession? Are you filling the gap of outreach, witnessing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Ask yourself that question before God, honestly. What am I doing? Into chapter 4, verse 1. But it came to pass that when Sanballat, you've come across him and Tobiah before, and Geshem, it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, what do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. So Sanballat is looking on, and he sees what the Jews are doing. And he sees enough to be annoyed. But rather than admit that he's annoyed, he turns his frustration into propaganda and mocks the Jews in order to annoy them. Do you see what's going on here? He's transferring his emotions and his anger onto the Jews. He's redirecting his emotions to the Jews. Rather than insult them to their face, he tries something probably far more devious and maybe even more effective. He spreads the mockery around the country, knowing that it will eventually reach the ears of the Jews, and in that way be far more effective, because the whole reason that Nehemiah was stirred up to go back to Jerusalem in the first place was that the testimony of the Lord in the area was like mud. The testimony of the Lord had been torn down. The glory of the Lord was in tatters and shreds and in disgrace. And that's because the people around were laughing at the state of the ruined city. And now Sanballat is working on this. And he wants the Jews to hear this, if you like, secondhand. This is what people are saying. And his words went something like this: the Jews are feeble. Imagine poking through rubbish to find building materials. They'll never be able to secure the city and protect themselves. They'll never finish the job. They'll never hold a dedication service. That's what he was saying. And that's what he spread. Negativity. And then Tobiah chips in and he supports Sanballat's claims. And he goes even farther. He says, if something as little and as light as a wee fox, nimble-footed fox, were to climb up over the bits they have built, sure, it would just topple all the stones down. Propaganda. I'm sure some of you heard of a character during the Second World War called Lord Haw-Haw. Or you've heard about him anyway. And this is Berlin calling. And he would get his channel into all the homes of the people here in Britain who had loved ones out fighting in the front line, and he would tell them a wee bit like what's going on actually with Russia. They have their idea of what they're telling their people is going on, and it's completely divorced from the truth. Well, Lord Haw-Haw was doing that deliberately to ruin morale here, so that everybody would think that the British were being defeated, when the opposite was the truth. But there's a power in propaganda. Be careful what you listen to. Be careful how you're taken in by things. We were talking to the children there about questioning. This is the time for believers to be questioning, not the time to be blindly accepting everything as truth when it's not. Because there's a big deceiver coming, and his name is the Antichrist. And I believe we're just ripe for that. Ripe for it. Verse 4. I love this. Here's a great antidote for propaganda. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn our reproach upon their own head. Give them for a prey to the hand of captivity. Cover not their iniquity. Let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. And that's quite a prayer. But they pray. They pray. They turn away from what they're hearing, what's coming at them, the negativity, and they take it to the Lord in prayer. Now, it seems upon first reading to be quite harsh, especially coming from a servant of the Lord. But what has actually happened here? Well, I think firstly, the Jews are handing their enemies over to God. That's a good thing to do. You see, they could have abandoned their building program, and as we will have discovered, or will discover more, that they will be working with trowel in one hand and with a dagger in the other. They'll be preparing themselves for an onslaught, for an assault, for an attack. They will be able to defend themselves. So they would have had enough weapons that they could actually, instead of just preparing to defend themselves, they could have gone on the attack. But they handed their enemies over to God. Do you know, sometimes we get ourselves into such messes because when we're attacked, we attack back. Isn't that right? Many of the times we've had to make the most searing apologies are because we were attacked, yes, but then we attacked back. Now, we will not give an account for the things that come to us, but we will give an account for the reaction that we make to what happens to us. They took it to the Lord in prayer. Romans 12:19 says, "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. Why? For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." Secondly, the Jews recognize in this prayer that their oppressors are ultimately mocking God. It's not just about them. And here's the problem with us in church life and in the Lord's work, whatever sphere of service we happen to be in, and something happens to us or somebody comes against us, we momentarily forget that it's all about God, and we think for a moment or two it's all about us. And there's another problem. And it's hard to get around that, because you need to be thinking clearly, or you need to be in a very good spiritual standing, or maybe have been in the Lord's presence that day to the point where He has been preparing your heart for something like this, because it's so easy to just fly off the handle or to react badly whenever we're hurt or attacked or injured. It's God who's provoked. And it's about Him being provoked more than about me being provoked. More than about me getting my pound of flesh, getting my apology. It's God who's been offended, and I'm only His servant. When the Jews desired that their oppressors' plans should be turned on their own heads, this was them asking God to do that, not them taking action themselves to do that. They were handing it over to God. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. And that's exactly what they did, because at Nehemiah 4 and verse 6 we read this. So built we the wall. You know, sometimes when we take things into our own hands, and we don't wait in the Lord when an issue arises, if we had waited, the Lord would have taken far more serious dealings with the group or individuals. But we mess things up because we think vengeance is mine. Vengeance is His. And He will avenge. But we mess things up. They leave it there. So we built the wall. Straight back into the Lord's work. No going off in a period of licking their own wounds and maybe in a long, never-ending huff. And if only you knew what was done to me, and so on. I could live like that. But I choose not to, and the Lord has given me the grace not to. What's our question today? Have I got stickability? How often have pastors and elders had to deal with situations and they all begin something like this: he said or she said. Isn't that right? And the offended person walks away, sometimes never to get engaged in the Lord's work ever again. Ever again. Immobilized. Why? By the devil. Who gets the victory? The devil. Have I got stickability? So we built the wall. In other words, we got on with it. And this little phrase lets us know that the building work was a synchronized effort. All the aforementioned workers, they started where they were, the gap that they were responsible for. They started there at ground level, and they started level by level. And that means that when we read this little verse, we discover that by the time Sam Ballott's comments were made, the wall was just half of its original height or half of its proposed height. But it was the same the whole way around. It had been raised up to that point. They weren't finished yet. They still had a work to do. It wasn't a time for giving up. They were halfway there. And it had been going up as an unbroken whole. Do you see the attack to come in and change all that? But verse 6 also tells us that the people had a mind to work. Or the people were minded to work with all of their heart. Are you minded to work with all of your heart? Because that's a key to understanding what happened in those days. They were minded to work with all their heart. They were being mocked. They were being scorned. They were being laughed at. They were being set up. Propaganda was rife. They had stickability because in spite of it all, they were minded to work with all their heart. You know, we can look at this one and that one in church life and we can say, well, they don't do very much and they don't. And we can always compare ourselves. We'll always find somebody worse than ourselves, believe it or not. It's not that hard. But the Bible doesn't tell us ever to do that. We are never once encouraged to look at a lower example. Who are we encouraged to look to? And this is what we discover about the example Jesus set. John 5:17, the words of Jesus. My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. They're not afraid to work. God's always working. Jesus is working. Jesus has done an amazing work. John 9:4. I must work the works of him that sent me. And in John 17:4, I have glorified thee on earth. I have finished the work that thou gavest me to do. Having a mind to work with all your heart is not only God glorifying, it's being godlike. You know the term godly? You want to be godly? You want to be Christ-like? We need stickability. Verse 7, Nehemiah 4. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, so the opposition's growing. See that? There's allies coming on board here. That when they heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth and conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Do you know the enemy doesn't give up easily, does he? Can you see the tension? You see these people with their mind to work with all their heart, with their stickability. It's not easy because here comes a counterattack. And the enemy does not give up easily. Remember, as you read through the epistles and you come to the armour of God and so on, you discover that it's principalities and powers, not flesh and blood. Never underestimate the power of Satan. The enemy doesn't give up easily, but you know that can't be said of all believers, sadly. The opposition continues because the devil isn't happy. Verse 9. Nevertheless, here's the stickability again. We made our prayer unto God. They're back praying. Have you noticed the way that Nehemiah and his fellow workers deal with conflict and discouragement? Straight to prayer. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto God, our God, and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. Our adversaries said, they shall not know neither see till we come in the midst among them and slay them and cause the work to cease. And it came to pass that when the Jews which dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, from all places whence ye shall return unto us, they will be upon you. 3 negative assaults, 3 negative voices found here. Judah, well, it's the tribe of Judah, the nation of Judah, identified as Judah, that were carried captive to Babylon and that have been making their return. So even amongst themselves, what do they see as they look around? They see a fatigued people. Then we find that the adversaries, when they look around, they see a people who are focused on the work, but they're maybe so focused on the work that they're blind to attack. Now we have to be careful about that, especially those who are in full-time service, so focused on the work that we're blind to attacks. And this is why in our prayer meetings, Over and over you hear me talking about never underestimate the devil. The devil wants to get, and especially when he sees good things happening and a good spirit amongst us as a fellowship, we need to always be thinking that an attack could be imminent. And then thirdly, the Jewish neighbours who were neighbours of those adversaries, and we've looked at some of those before, they taunted. And they were convinced that they would be ambushed from every side, and they said this at least 10 times, over and over and over the same thing. Now, in face of that, you need to have stickability. Well, who or what am I listening to today? Who or what are you listening to today? Verse 13, we read, "Therefore, I set in the lower places behind the wall, and in the higher place I even set the people after their families with their swords, their spears, their bows, and I looked." So, what's Nehemiah's response? He immediately protects the workers and their families by bringing them all within the walled area. He looks. So, they can't say that nobody's being unobservant. He is. He's looking. And then, after that, he speaks. Verse 14, "I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and the rulers, to the rest of the people," here's a great little line, "Be not ye afraid of them, remember the Lord." If there's somebody here and that's a word for you, that might just be all you need this morning. Be not afraid, remember the Lord. That goes on to say this here. "Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Fear not." Jesus said, "Fear not them which kill the body," Matthew 10 and 28, "but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." You know, so many people who aren't saved, and they know that they need to be saved, and probably maybe even want to be saved, but there are people around them that they might have to tell, might have to eventually own up and say, "Look, folks, I can't go there with you anymore, can't do, because I've got saved." Jesus is saying, listen, don't be afraid of them. Fear him who has the power to cast both your body and soul into hell. Psalm 118 verse 6, "The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me?" There's a limit to what man can do to us. It can do certain things to us, but there's a limit. And they cannot take away the assurance of God's nearness. Even if we were being burned on a stake, they can't do that. You wouldn't swap a martyr's death for the death of the person that put the martyr to death. Fear not. "The fear of man bringeth the snare," Proverbs 29:25, "but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe." Be not afraid of them. Remember the Lord. Do you know what happens? We forget the Lord and embrace fear. We open our hearts to fear. It's a choice. Verse 15, "And it came to pass when our enemies heard that it was known unto us that God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, every one unto his work. And it came to pass from that time forth that the half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both the spears, the shields, and the bows. The habergeons and the rulers were behind all the house of Judah. They which builded on the wall, and they that bare burdens, with those that laid it, every one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. For the builders, every one had his sword girded by his side, and so builded. And he that sounded the trumpet was by me." I'm sure some of you are already thinking of the words that are attributed to Oliver Cromwell, where he said, "Fear God, but keep your powder dry." And that's a kind of an instance of this. But if you think back scripturally to other occasions, remember the Passover. You were to eat the Passover, but you were to do it with your loins girded and your staff in your hand, in readiness and preparedness. We also think of in more recent history, although it's still several centuries ago, the Covenanters were being persecuted, and they used to stand and pray. And if I asked you to stand to pray and then told you, now would you turn around and face the door, you'd think my head was cut. But that's how they did. They prayed because once or twice their congregations had been broken up because Claverhouse and his men knew that when they would be praying, they'd have their heads bowed and their eyes closed. And what a time to come in and slaughter them. They started to pray facing the door. Oh, aye. Trust in God and pray, but face the door anyway, in preparedness and in readiness. 19 of chapter 4. And I said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, the work is great and large, and we are separated upon the wall, one far from another, as I mentioned earlier. There were no gaps in responsibility, but there were plenty of areas where they would have to go a wee bit before they could have a conversation with the next person. And in verse 20, in what place thereof ye hear the sound of the trumpet, resort ye thither unto us. Our God shall fight for us. Verse 19, the work is great and large, and we are separated the one from the other. Isn't that a telling statement? The work is great and large, and we're separated one from the other. I want you to picture with me harvest time on a farm, and the harvest has all been gathered in, but a fire has broken out, and all of the harvest is at risk of being lost. And just a couple of field lengths away, there is a massive lake. Now, the harvest has been a bumper year. There's been a great yield, and there's an enormous amount of store being held in the barns. And it's huge. And the lake is huge. But the threat of the fire is also huge, and it's starting to get hold. It's ferocious. So there's an amazing challenge. Because there's quite a distance between the great fire that's taken hold on the great harvest and the even greater lake that's full of far more water than could ever be needed to quench the fire. But what was the solution? It was a great team. And the great team formed a chain, and they got the water bucket by bucket to quench the fire. They couldn't afford one gap. Sure, they couldn't. The resources were great in the lake. We have a great God. We have a great God who can do anything. We also have a great need. There are people who are going to be burning in hell for all eternity. And that harvest could be lost. And you know what's between that great lake, that great need, that great God, and that great loss that could happen is you and me. We could come together. We could fill up the gaps. We could work in harmony. And we could be the channels. That's all your hymns about channels of blessing. That's what it means. We could be the channels for the power of God and the living waters of God to flow and make a difference to those who would otherwise be lost. Our God shall fight. So we laboured in the work. Verse 21. From the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. There's an old hymn that used to be sung. I don't know if many people still know it today. Work for the night is coming. Work for the night is coming. And what a night is coming. What a night is coming upon the lost. We've only got today. And let's be doing our job for the Lord. Thank you for listening.